Welcome back to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. In this segment today, as we continue coverage of the ongoing attacks in the Middle East between Israel, Palestine, Hamas, we're going to be looking specifically right now at how big media have facilitated the Israeli war crimes in Gaza. And we're going to chronicle corporate media's dehumanization of Palestinians, the lack of historical context given in that Western reporting, by and large, and how the Western press repeats hearsay as fact to make the current tragedy unintelligible to most Americans. In other words, it's difficult for the American public to respond to things happening in a way that is commensurate with the facts when the American public don't have all of the facts historically and contemporaneously. And for this discussion, we are joined by media scholar Robin Andersen. She's a Project Censored judge and contributor to the forthcoming State of the Free Press 2024 book, award-winning author, professor emerita of communications and media studies at Fordham University, editor of the Routledge Focus book series on media and humanitarian action. Robin's latest books include Investigating Death in Paradise, Finding New Meaning in the BBC Mystery Series, and the forthcoming Censorship, Digital Media, and Global Crackdown on Freedom of Expression, which actually we have a chapter in. In addition, Robin writes regularly for Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, as well as for us at Project Censored. Robin Andersen, thank you for joining us once again on the Project Censored Show.
Thanks for inviting me, Mickey. I'm happy to be here.
Indeed, and you always are game to talk about these very important issues, and they're often dark. This topic today, no exception. You recently wrote a piece, a dispatch to ProjectCensored.org, where people can see it for free, how big media facilitate Israeli war crimes in Gaza. And it's a pretty lengthy piece. It's it's academic and, in my view, a lot of the best ways. It's extraordinarily well documented and cited with a lot of links and notes. Robin Andersen, can you kind of kick us off here with your frame for talking about the issue going on now between Israel, Palestine, and the apartheid-occupied situation there?
Thanks, Mickey. Well, as you well know, I've been writing about war, media and war for many years now, and it's easy to recognize a war frame. And basically what happens is the violence of our enemies is always unprovoked and out of nowhere. So when I say our enemies, we've long framed this very simple dichotomy between Israel and Hamas and the Palestinians. Is Israel is been so effective at lobbying everybody that there's, in American public life, there's almost no way to involve a critique or criticism of the Israeli actions in any of the occupied territories, and certainly not in Gaza. And there's no counter arguments to explain what's actually happening. So the violence of Hamas just came out of nowhere. It's unprecedented. And we can see this developing right at the beginning. So there's no historical background. And what that allows them to do is quickly then come in and demonize Hamas. If there's no way to explain it, then Hamas can only be motivated by their pure evil. They're terrorists, they're not human, they're animals. I saw this one horrible cartoon or image of a cockroach, and of course we know that that's a classic propaganda, enemy propaganda frame. Without that, right away then, with this kind of endless loop of how the Hamas attacks kill civilians, and they did, and it was terrible, and we could talk about that a little bit again. But right away, the Israeli military and the prime minister got online and said, they want to do this to us. Well, then we're going to turn them into rubble. We're going to turn them into a tent city. These inhumane animals will now be destroyed. And then all of a sudden, the Hamas attacks are now demonizing the entire population within Gaza. And that is very much sounding like now a call to genocide.
So we've heard, direct quotes from people in the Israeli government that are, again, it's the language is extraordinary in its brutality and the dehumanization. And that's part of the program here. part of the
Right.
protocol is to otherize, demonize, dehumanize. One of the themes brought up earlier in the program with Andy Lee Roth on unpersons and unhistory, talked with Manar Adley. We brought up, of course, the concept of worthy and unworthy victims. And this is unfortunately, Robin Andersen, a textbook case of how media frame this, up to and including how the media are framing any Palestinian-centric voices as being disinformation. Robin Andersen.
Right. And then you add on to that this demonization. You add on what we've been talking about. I'm sure you've already noticed the atrocity propaganda. Many organizations and groups who fight for Palestinian rights and have identified the Israeli occupation as apartheid have called on the human rights violations of the Israeli state, the Center for Constitutional Rights, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, have all been identifying Israeli aggressive violence against Palestinians, and they condemned the Hamas attacks. And they said, because we believe in human dignity, with this very humanitarian principle coming into the news frame, because we believe in humanitarian dignity and the rights of all citizens, we condemn the attacks because these were against citizens. So that should have been enough. But then you add on to the ahistorical model and the mystification of violence. You now add on atrocity propaganda. So they chopped off the babies' heads and they raped women, none of which was verified. And so what the American media did is, many in the American media and in the UK, they just repeated this atrocity propaganda. And what that does is that's the bloodiest, most hate-inducing, extreme kind of visceral emotional war propaganda that's been around for a very long time, should have been recognized as a war propaganda trope, but wasn't, and was repeated. So that increased momentum again toward this. Israeli can defend itself. We can now move to whatever actions we need to take. And that's how we got here today, trying to halt a ceasefire and halt a genocide in Gaza.
So, Robin Andersen, you write in your article, again, the article is available at projectcensored.org for free as part of our long form dispatches. It's been picked up by several other outlets, of course, and is making the rounds. You write, Gregory Shupak examined editorial pages of major U.S. newspapers after the October 7 Hamas attacks, looking specifically at, say, the Wall Street Journal op-ed. They had a piece titled "The Moral Duty to Destroy Hamas," telling its readers, quote, "Israel is entitled to do whatever it takes to uproot this evil, depraved culture that resides next to it," calling for the destruction of Hamas and extending a call to exterminate, quote, "the culture," which is basically a call for genocide. And they had Israeli announcements that said they were going to turn Gaza literally into, quote, hell, quote, rubble, and, quote, a city of tents. And in fact, Robin, you go on to say that at Haaretz and others in Israel, the coverage is actually more diverse. There's actually more opposition in the Israeli press, seems to be, than there is in the U.S. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, Haaretz actually wrote that Israeli, and admitted that the Israeli army had been increasing Israeli presence in around the mosque and the Capitol Dome, and they had been a long time attacking the Palestinian lands, and we know they've been weaponizing settlers for a very long time. So that was extraordinary. And yeah, the Wall Street Journal, we know that it's now a Murdoch voice, and it's moved its editorial voices to the right. And oftentimes what we find with right-wing and Fox News and Murdoch sources is that they tend to have this tendency to say out loud what other legacy media and mainstream media, establishment media is just implying. So without any historical context, you can then call them, demonize them, and then say you can defend yourself in any way you want. That's one thing. But now to come right out, let's just have the Wall Street journalists come right out and say they need to uproot a culture. That is the very definition of violation of Geneva conventions, where you can't attack so what the mainstream has also done is equate the leaders and the fighters, Hamas, demonize them so much that and then they just mix them up with the Palestinians, with everybody in Gaza, and now they can be attacked without any accountability, without any stuff, without any cautionary voices, without any humanitarian voices, without anybody from the UN saying, this is where this is going to lead, and now of course we've got the Secretary General saying that, and the UN's calling this is incitement, and putting it's saying this is now war crimes, this is genocide, and talking about the role of the media in it.
Well, I mean,
and also,
I'm sorry, Robin, it's hard to say. I mean, it's hard to ignore that this is, I mean, you've got top-ranking Israeli officials, including in the military, talking about just wanton destruction. I mean, they're openly talking about committing war crimes. You write in the article that some that have been, looking at what's happening at the targeting of civilians, the forcible displacement after Israeli orders to leave. You write about how it's a blatant violation of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and again, much of that hasn't been reported in the West. Also, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, whom we mentioned moments ago, while decrying, what he sees as fake news across the internet, spreads his own by saying what separates Israel, the U.S., and other democracies is our respect for international law and the laws of war. Yet just the other day, he was confronted by the press pool in Washington that asked the basic question about the death toll of Palestinian civilians, which he nearly refused to answer, basically focusing on, quote, Hamas propaganda and disinformation. And these reporters, including up to CNN, were saying, well, look, we know we don't trust Hamas. And so they're backfilling the propaganda that anything that's attributed to Hamas is bogus and false, and anything that the West says is true, right? That's the automatic default. But Blinken was forced to admit sheepishly, after several minutes of repeating questions, that yes, in fact, thousands of Palestinians had died, which, is a backwards way of saying it wasn't just Hamas propaganda. I mean, granted, any kind of information like that is going to function as propaganda against Israel because it's bad news for them. But Blinken sheepishly admits it. After he says it's all disinformation, he basically begrudgingly admits that, yeah, thousands of Palestinian civilians are probably dead. And then they move on. I mean, they
with
move
the
along.
kind of saturation bombing they're doing, it's logical. You can really don't even have to have listen to Hamas numbers. All you have to do is know that they have saturated bombed Gaza to the extent there's no functioning healthcare at the moment. They turned off water, they turned off electricity. Do they not think that thousands and thousands of
400 sorties over Manhattan? Imagine what would happen if you cut all the power and everything to place like Manhattan and drop 400 sorties, bombs over it. I mean, again, we don't think that way in the United States, and the media certainly don't portray it that way. Although we're very quick to talk about Israelis' 9/11. We're very quick to glom onto the atrocity porn and propaganda, as you were pointing out earlier, thus preemptively justifying anything Israel does in response to. And again, I've said it earlier on the show, the Hamas attacks against civilians in Israel is horrible. That's not being disputed, but there's no context given in the West. There's no history of it. It's all buried, and anybody that wants to talk about it is somehow anti-Semitic, and that trope needs to go away. Robin Andersen.
It absolutely does. The idea, again, that we're going to do everything to you until you release the hostages. Again, that's Hamas. We can say about the Israelis, they have so many Palestinians, activists, dissident voices, journalists in their prisons on administrative detention without charges. What are those people? They seem to be hostages to me. They're jailed without charge for months on end, so much so that it's an actual strategy whereby they get journalists to leave the profession and making it too difficult for them and too dangerous to report from Gaza. In terms of if we're going to talk about this in body counts, our colleague Greg Shupak has documented, and I give you a link in the article. Since 2008, 9 out of 10 of people that have been killed in this conflict are on the Palestinian side. There are plenty of numbers which show that there's been many more numbers. And of course, there's different recording data. There's different ways that these things, by any measure, one measure is that over 6,000 Palestinians been killed by one of the human rights sources, and 307 Israelis have been killed. So we're talking about a disproportionate number of Palestinian and deaths to Israeli deaths, and that is never explained. Israeli violence is very rarely even talked about. And when it is not subject to the same type of narrative that Hamas or Palestinian violence is not criticized. They get out of it with these long, complicated things. Oh, this is a conflict, and they mystify it. And so we can't get to that. One more thing about how a little bit crazy it is to be talking about our enemies' propaganda when Israeli propaganda it's been so obvious. And when I was writing last year about the Israeli assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh,
the journalist, Palestinian American journalist,
who worked for Al Jazeera, and there was so much outrage that they had assassinated her. Very well-known Palestinian American. Much pressure was put on Biden. The Israelis came out immediately with their propaganda, just like they did with the bombing of the hospital in Gaza recently. And they showed a video of a Palestinian fighter and said, no, this is the guy who did it. So how does this work for the Israelis? It delays everything. There's probably a dozen very detailed the line of the shooter, where everybody was. Finally, the New York Times admitted that this was an Israeli convoy that killed Shireen Abu Akleh. It was in her neck. She had a helmet on and a vest, clearly marked as, and that became her target. That made her a target. So and then when the bombing of, do you remember, Mickey, that the New York Times led with Israeli strike levels, Gaza hospital killing 500 Palestinians, say right away that headline changed after Israel came out. They said it was a misfired Palestinian target,
Hamas rocket.
Then they released a tape that had two Palestinians talking, a Palestinian and a jihadist, and they're talking about how it was their rocket, their missile. And so very quickly, it's easy to tell that these people are not speaking the right kind of Arabic. They're speaking in a dialect. They don't have the right accents. And so that was easily discredited. But still, now they've got the Pentagon in it working with the Israelis to come up with every kind of reason, a possible way that this could possibly have been a Hamas rocket. They do not have the kind of ordnance and missiles that could level that hospital. And yet, yesterday, it's still being discussed in The Guardian as, let's take another look. More evidence has come out over and over again. This will ultimately come out as the Israelis. And yet, this delaying tactics allows the genocide to go on.
Delaying tactics. And it's important, I think, that we point out here that let's even say that it turns out in this instance that Israel is correct and it is an errant, for the sake of argument. This does not discount the scores and scores and scores of other times where Israel has been attacking Palestinian civilian infrastructure, including in the last 2 weeks, and so
that's right.
To pivot here, to the end of your article, choosing humanity over killing and destruction. You write, U.S. establishment media should consider humanitarian narratives in contrast to standard militarized revenge frames that only fan the flames of genocide that imperil Palestinian people. So, Robin Andersen, in the last couple minutes we have here, could you talk maybe about some of the prospects for a ceasefire? Groups like the Center for Constitutional Rights are calling for this, many other international organizations, Jewish Voices for Peace, etc. Can you comment on this, Robin Andersen?
Absolutely. There's no sense in this violence. Israel has moved closer to the right. The government has gotten more extreme and more oppressive and more murderous. And what are they gaining? The cycle of violence really has to be called out and stopped. It's really the only way that we can get back to a position where the two-state solution has not been implemented in any way, mostly by the way in which the United States has not called out the Israelis for all of their human rights violations, their constant violations of international law. And until that happens, we can't get to a place where we could solve any of the problems. For example, the way that South African apartheid was resolved was with a single state solution where everybody has a vote. That's never on the table, but they move so far away outside of this belligerency, this kind of we don't talk, this pride of American foreign policy that we never talk to terrorists. Once labeled terrorists, you can never have a peace negotiation with them again. So we've got to get to a point where the cycle of violence. Stand-up comedians that was at one of the demonstrations, and he kept calling over the microphone, where is the humanity? How are we going to stop this? We're so far out of the building of international law that happened after World War I and II in the latter half of the 20th century. So many violations of it, primarily from the United States and the Israelis, that something's got to give here. Right now, they're successfully pushing all of the Palestinians into the Sinai, which it has probably been on their agenda for quite a while. But this is called ethnic cleansing, and Israel will not benefit from this. To stop this will benefit the Israelis and the Palestinians. The Israeli state, so many people around the world know what is happening there, that I cannot see a future for the Israeli state to accomplish these goals and really still be an entity within the global framework of citizenship and nationality.
Well, Robin Andersen, we're about out of time in this segment. And as we're speaking, I want to point out it is Friday, October 27. This program will air across the U.S. next week, when multiple things are likely to have developed. And as we were talking, it's just come in that Palestinians are reporting a total communication blackout as Israel expands the ground operation. That's happening literally right now as you and I are speaking. And so there will be news, unfortunately. It doesn't look as though the things are going to get better in the near future, though we certainly hope for ceasefire, Robin. And we certainly hope that people, particularly in the West, read more of work by people like yourself, like Shupak, like the work at Mint Press. Certainly for the last 20 years, we've been documenting this kind of stuff at ProjectCensored.org. I think if people knew more of the historical context, there might be more international pressure, particularly coming from the US and EU, to really push some kind of potential solution here to end the carnage.
And we know that Blinken is behind the blackout because he's told Al Jazeera to tone it down, and Al Jazeera has always had access to any of the wars in the Middle East. And
Amy Klobuchar in Minnesota, the Democrats are crowing for more censorship on social media. The Republicans are just calling to expel people. They're going to not renew student visas, and Trump's talking about kicking people that are protesting Israel out of the country. The Democrats are talking about kicking them off of media platforms, metaphorically similar, right? So we you talk about a two-state solution. We don't even have a two-party solution over here, where we have a uniparty when it comes to this issue. And
we've got Cori Bush, we've got Rashida Tlaib. They're calling for a ceasefire. Everybody needs it's tiny, I know, but everybody needs to call up and a ceasefire. And
need to have more voices in there talking about the real immediate efficacy of ceasefire. We know that at this juncture, only innocent people are suffering and dying, and it's a horrendous tragedy that's befalling this right in front of our eyes. And, the media really do have a power to make a difference, as the Project Censored's founder, Carl Jensen, once said, but it really depends how they use and wield that power. And, as ever at Project Censored, we hope that media wields the power and the benefit of the 99%, not the 1%. that the media operate in the interest of we the people and the public interest, and not the oligarchy and military industrial complex.
And me, you and me, and we have been really trying to deconstruct the Israeli propaganda over many years, that the Israelis are the single democracy on the hill in the Holy Land where they'd be safe, a land without a people and a people without a land, and we have to deconstruct the way that the Israelis have lobbied and blocked and censored the American press.
They're going to be victims of their own propaganda campaigns, Robin Andersen, and yes, this is what we see with the backlash and the things that are happening, all terrible things. But this is why we need this kind of journalism in the public interest. So thank you for the important work you do, writing for us both at Project Censored and also fair.org. People can certainly find your work online. Robin Andersen, Andersen, is how you can find Robin. Her latest article, How Big Media Facilitate Israeli War Crimes in Gaza, is available at ProjectCensored.org. Again, you can find her work at fair.org. Robin Andersen, as ever, thanks for the important work you do, and we certainly look forward to having you back on the program in the near future.
Thanks, Mickey.